This is Frank Quinn, Editorial Director of Supply Chain Management Review, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our webcast on social in the supply chain, unlocking the collaboration potential. This webcast is presented by Supply Chain Management Review and sponsored by E2Open. We're joined today by Lorenzo Martinelli of E2Open and Michael Chui of the McKinsey Global Institute. Now, this is an extremely timely webcast. We'll be looking at the power and potential of social technologies to improve communication and collaboration in the supply chain space. And we have two highly qualified speakers to address that topic. Michael Chui is principal of the McKinsey Global Institute. He's based in San Francisco, where he directs research on the impact of information technologies such as social media and big data on business and the economy. Michael is a frequent speaker at major global conferences, and his research has been cited in numerous well-known publications, such as the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Forbes, and The Economist, among many others. And Michael will be joined by Lorenzo Martinelli, a Senior Vice President, Corporate Strategy for E2Open. And Lorenzo joined E2Open in 2001 and was part of the original executive team that shaped the company to its current leadership position. At E2Open, he's held a variety of key management positions in global sales, marketing, solution engineering, and account management. And in his current position, Lorenzo was responsible for corporate strategy and global alliances. So as I indicated, we have a very qualified panel to address this topic. Now, after the formal presentations, we'll have a Q&A session with our speakers, and we encourage everyone to stay tuned for that because a lot of good information comes up during that portion of the webcast. So to get us underway, it's a real pleasure to introduce Michael Chui.
Frank, thanks so much for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for taking some time to discuss this topic. What we did at MGI was really look broadly at the impact of social technologies, which we've defined as technologies where there are distributed rights to create information or co-create information, as well as distributed rights where you have groups of people who can access that information through information technology. So that's a broad swath of technologies. It's everything from blogs and wikis to social networks. And so what we tried to understand was all the ways in which these technologies could actually capture value. And we looked broadly across a number of different industries as well as a number of different business functions. But before we dive deeply into some of the research that we've been doing, we've actually been looking at these technologies for the past 6 years. Wanted to just get a sense for the scope and scale of these technologies. And quite frankly, what we discovered was that social technologies and social media are the fastest growing media that have ever been adopted in human history. So if you compare it to technologies such as radio and TV, which have great widespread adoption, these social technologies, these technologies that allow people to have distributed rights to co-create information, as well as distributed rights to access or consume that information, have been adopted faster than any other technology in human history. Now, that being said, you might ask, well, I've heard about this stuff before. We use social media. I have, an account on a social networking site or platform, et cetera. Why in the world is it interesting to look at now? Well, our point of view is that, in fact, as widely adopted as it is, and, over 1.5 billion people do use these technologies or even just social networking on a fairly regular basis around the world, we think that, in fact, and our research has shown that we're just starting on a journey in terms of both the adoption of these technologies and then particularly the ability to capture value from using these technologies in business. So even on the adoption side, I said 1.5 billion people around the world are using these technologies. That still leaves actually several more billion, in fact, just to adopt these technologies. But then even in the U.S. or other developed countries where the adoption rate is quite high, where a large percentage of the population and quite frankly, a large percentage of the business population are using these technologies. As we've been surveying thousands of global executives, we're finding that over 80% of these organizations they represent are using these technologies. And yet, if you actually look at, and this chart shows over the past 100 years, the ways in which people communicate, the ways in which people consume information, if you look at everything from telephone to newspapers and books and telegraphs, etc., if you look at all the ways in which people consume information, only about 5% of that time or 5% of those words is in fact through these types of social networks or social communications. So what that says to us is there's still a tremendous headroom for adoption of these technologies. And then what we'll show is in fact there'll be even more headroom in terms of the opportunity to use these technologies to derive value. Now that being said, one of the things that we discovered is out of all of the companies in our surveys that have reported using these technologies, fully 90% of them are reporting some sort of business benefit from using them. That being said, most of those companies are only deriving a small percentage. So it says to us there is headroom. It is possible to capture value, and most companies are reporting capturing some value, but there's a huge amount of headroom that can be captured, and a great deal that can actually be captured through supply chain as well. So when we actually looked at all the ways in which value could be captured using these technologies, we found the possibility to capture value across the entire supply chain and across the entire value chain of companies, starting all the way from product development, where you can use these social technologies to improve the collaboration and communication for engineers. But then these technologies actually allow the organization's boundaries to become more porous. So the ability to crowdsource or derive customer insight that can powerfully influence what is developed, and then perhaps more importantly, what features and how to prioritize the development within product development. In operations and distribution and supply chain, it is possible to leverage social in order to do better forecasting. Now, this has been a challenging thing to be able to do, but we do think that there are interesting demand signals from, for example, consumers in terms of what they're interested in social networking. And so being able to leverage those signals in order to do better demand forecasting. But also, as the supply chains become increasingly globalized and disaggregated or reaggregated in new ways, the importance of being able to communicate and collaborate across the supply chain, across different players, increases over time. Then clearly in marketing sales, there's a tremendous amount that you're able to do here. Again, echoing a little bit what we found in product development, but being able to derive consumer or customer insight from these streams of social media is quite powerful. But then also being able to actually create a closed loop in terms of interacting actively with a customer base can be quite powerful in marketing and sales. Even in customer service, even post-sales, we're finding an increasing number of companies which are able to, not only mine the information that they're receiving in order to, do better demand planning or to improve the insight that they're providing into customers. We're also finding customers are able to provide each other with customer support. And when that happens, we can see we've modeled up to a 90% decrease in a per-contact cost from the use of customer communities to provide customer service to each other. And then, in business support functions. And then broadly across the enterprise, we're finding the ability, number one, to create teams. Because when you're able to actually access the broader talents of the entire organization across organizational silos, you're more likely to find the talent and put together the teams that you need. And when you actually access talent from outside the organization by making those organizational boundaries more porous, you can actually create teams that include both employees as well as people outside. Bill Joy has a phrase that he describes as Joy's Law, which is no matter how smart your employees are, almost always the best person is going to be outside your organization. So how do you tap that talent? And of course then there's also the ability to just simply improving communications and collaboration across the enterprise. And we'll talk more about that later and the importance of that. So as we did this research, we really looked across a number of different industry segments. We would have liked to look at all of them, but in fact we focused on financial services, consumer packaged goods, professional services, advanced manufacturing, and the social sector or nonprofit sector. And then we tried to, that's a broad swath of the economy that's meant to, have some services, some products, some B2C, some B2B, et cetera, just to give some variety. And then also look across the entire value chain from product development all the way through customer service to business support functions. And in each of those, areas of the matrix, we tried to understand how social technologies could impact positively, could improve the performance of, that business function within, that sector. And of course, we actually have some specific subsectors there. What this heat map shows on the screen here is where we found the most benefits and where we found moderate amounts of benefit and smaller amounts of benefits as well. And this heat map is relative to the spend or the amount of effort within each business function. So look at each of these vertical columns. And so what we find, perhaps unsurprisingly, is that a lot of the benefit on a functional basis, per function, comes in marketing and sales, because you are able, in fact, to derive more insight about your consumers through these social streams, and you are able to interact with them, get your messages out, but more importantly, have other people talk about, the marketing messages that you have, because in general, you're going to have more impact from people you know, hearing something from someone you know, rather than from some sort of paid advertising. And we do see a lot of impact on customer service as well. Again, customers providing service to each other. But we also see quite a bit of impact in product development, because with a lot of engineers, there's a huge opportunity in collaboration and communication. But that doesn't control for the amount of spend in each that varies within each vertical. And so the next slide actually shows what's the potential impact when you actually, take into account the amount that's spent in different areas. And so what we see is that the heat map actually changes. Because, for example, in advanced manufacturing, there's a lot less spend in sales and marketing and a lot more spend in manufacturing and supply chain. And that's why we're starting to see in those sectors, for instance, in automotive, aerospace, and defense, we're seeing more benefit coming from social technologies when, in fact, you look at how much benefit there is relative to revenues, which is what this chart shows. So, again, while the percentage might be small in operations and distribution in those industries, the spend is so high that the potential benefit of using these technologies is very high. So we look very specifically at advanced manufacturing. Where are the benefits coming from? Well, in product development, for instance, a lot of the impact, as I said before, comes from improving collaboration amongst research and development workers, those engineers, those large numbers of people who are involved in developing these very complex products in semiconductors, for instance, or in automotive. But then also in operations and distribution, where we do have these complex supply chains and where the opportunity to improve collaboration is very great. Again, most of the spend here is not necessarily on collaboration and communication. But because the spend is so large, because this is such an important part of these industries, the actual impact is quite considerable. There are, in fact, impact in marketing and sales, particularly in automotive, where it really is a B2B2C business. But in fact, the OEMs actually do interact directly in marketing with consumers, and so there's real opportunity there. And then some continuing opportunity in customer service and business support functions as well. But we do think that there is considerable opportunity to improve collaboration and communication, particularly across the supply chains, whether it's within a company or across company boundaries. Now, that being said, as much discussion as we've had about marketing and sales, and quite frankly, the amount that is talked about marketing and sales, in the press, for instance, and with consumers, when we actually modeled it out, and that's what this next chart shows, 2/3 of all the impact that we could find, 2/3 of all the impact that we could find from using social technologies comes from improving collaboration and communication within and across the enterprise. Twice as much as there are from all other opportunities combined. Now, that being said, in some industries, such as consumer packaged goods, most of the impact does come about because of consumer marketing or marketing and sales with regard to consumers. But for many of these other industries, and particularly in some of these advanced manufacturing industries, semiconductors, auto, aerospace, et cetera, with complex supply chains, a lot of the impact, in fact, comes from collaboration and communication within and across the enterprise, which is a little bit of a surprising result given that what people talk about most of the time, which are consumer social networks. Now, why would we believe this to actually be the case? Well, if you look at an average knowledge worker's work week, what is it that people, white-collar workers do, or interactions workers, as we've called them, people who use judgment, have to collaborate in the work that they do? Well, something like 13 hours per week, or almost 30% of their time, often is spent either reading or sending email. And one of the other things that we've discovered in our research is that there's a tremendous amount of, let's call it, organizational dark matter, information that's actually very valuable that's trapped in people's mailboxes, in their inboxes. And, if you think about the information that most people have in their inbox, a lot of it actually is important enterprise information. And so how is it that you could make that information more shareable, more searchable? Email is designed as a one-to-one communications medium. We even have CC, carbon copy. It harkens back to another time. And so, one thing we ask is, how is it that you could use, that nearly 30% of the time that knowledge workers are spending in email more productively? Again, they're spending almost another 20% of their time searching and gathering information from across the enterprise, and another almost 15% communicating and collaborating internally. We think that the effective use of social technologies can improve almost all of those functions considerably, to the tune of improving the productivity of these knowledge workers by 20 to 25%. Why is that? Well, given all that information that's captured within and stuck within people's inboxes, wouldn't it be more powerful if in fact, the default way that people communicated with each other, made that communication content, made it in fact searchable by others. So in a supply chain, for instance, all this email that's flying back and forth, wouldn't it be more effective, in fact, if all the players within the supply chain were able to search for that information that now isn't stuck within people's inboxes? Or perhaps being able to find expertise faster as well. If you know what people are communicating about, you probably know what they know about. And so being able to find that expertise as well as the data within an organization, we think could be quite powerful. So that being said, if you looked actually across those advanced industries, those subsectors that we talked about, and you break down where those, that potential impact is, on this chart, the darker colored blue here are, the impact that comes from improved collaboration and communication. The lighter colored blue is all the impact from all of the other levers combined. What we find, for instance, is in product development, a huge amount can come from, collaboration. Also within operations and distribution and supply chain, a considerable percentage, almost half of that potential comes from using social, from improving collaboration and communication. Now, that being said, if all this, benefit is there, why hasn't it happened already? What are some of the challenges that, particularly in advanced manufacturing, we see? Well, if you take a look at the ability to share information, to a certain extent, advanced manufacturing is ahead of these other industries that we looked at. But there are some areas where, there are some challenges. For example, these industries often have, a considerable amount of regulation of various types. And then also, there is quite a bit of, concern around security. And when we surveyed again, these thousands of global executives, the number one concern about using social technologies or issue that needed to be addressed was around security. And in many of these advanced manufacturing, that data is extraordinarily important, competitively sensitive. So being able to manage, some of this information that you might actually want to communicate through social, make sure that the right people have access to it, but not the wrong people. Make sure that there's an audit trail is something that's very important. There's also a sense that, as we looked at culture, because, we describe these as social technologies for a reason, and we'll come back to the mindsets about this. But, in fact, you do have to have a culture that is a sharing culture, one that actually rewards the idea of, other people having information and sharing that information. Because in many organizations we find, particularly in middle management, a lot of the power or value that people believe they have comes from hoarding that information and what they have versus other people don't. Conversely, in an organization that is leading in the use of these technologies, really promotes sharing. It has more of an external orientation. And we find in some of these advanced manufacturing companies that, in fact, that is less the case. And then finally, one of the other challenges is simply the investment in technology. Now, these technologies, these social technologies aren't tremendously challenging from a pure IT standpoint, but you do need to have the baseline infrastructure in place, and that includes mobile connectivity, et cetera. And also, it does require some some investment in technology in order to put these in place. And typically what we find is certainly is a percentage of revenues and also in terms of adoption of these technologies, that some of these advanced manufacturing companies aren't as far ahead as some of the other industries. So that being said, let me wrap up with just an observation about the difference between deploying these types of social technologies versus the traditional types of technologies that we see in supply chain management and other types of enterprise software. And, increasingly we are seeing these social technologies integrated into supply chain management, and yet these principles and this sort of mindset shift will continue to be true. So in terms of, the front two in this slide talks about the understanding of the business and the focus of the impact when you think about traditional enterprise software, traditional supply chain management software. It is really around those formal processes, the way things are organized on the org chart. What it is that those enterprise standards, those are the things that that are transformed by the use of traditional enterprise software. But these social technologies, which to a certain extent are bottoms-up technologies, technologies that are used from the front line and the benefits bubble up, then what you really need to understand are the real patterns of interaction between employees and between members of the supply chain across different organizations. Well, who is actually talking to whom? What are the communities of practice? How do they actually operate? And how do you actually, get them to adopt these technologies? More like, a consumer software company. How do I create such a value proposition that people want to use this software? Whereas in typical enterprise software, you change the standard operating procedures. You know what seats these things are going to go into. You know what benefits you're going to get, and you just you roll it out milestone by milestone. So it's a very different way of thinking about the use of these technologies, a very different mindset that has to come about. But we do believe that over time, as these mindsets take hold and these technologies become more highly adopted, that we'll find real benefits across the enterprise, including these global complex supply chains. So with that, let me turn it over. We do have more information that's available on the web, freely available, which you can download if you want to see the full report, including the different details in different sectors. And then, of course, we're on Twitter and the web as well. But with that, why don't I turn it over to Lorenzo?
Well, thank you, Michael. That is absolutely great research. In my opinion, it is definitely the most comprehensive research I've seen on the applicability of social in the enterprise. So while McKinsey was doing this broad research, E2Open was also doing a research on his own supply chain. And in the next few minutes, I would like to share the highlights of the research findings. And before I do that, since we are a public company, I need to show you our safe harbor statement. Everything I will share today is strictly about the results of our research. Therefore, what I share with you should not be relied on as a promise or representation as to the future performance of the company. Anyway, to give you, before I start, a little bit of a context on our research, I assume you don't know much about E2Open, so I want to give you kind of a little bit of a perspective so you see the lens through which we did the research. We are a cloud-based software platform for trading networks, and we serve companies across 12 industries. The 12 industries listed on the slide here: aerospace and defense, computer peripherals, consumer goods, electronics, industrial manufacturing, logistics services, manufacturing services, metal equipment, semicon, telecom, and wholesale and distribution. So there's a bit of an overlap, obviously, with the work that Michael explained, but that's very much, our industry focus. The second thing is, on the right-hand side, there's just examples of the logos of companies on our network to give you a sense of, again, which perspective we have. So as you can see, most of them are very large global companies. But there is one common characteristic among all of them, regardless of industry, is that they all rely on a network of trading partners, whether suppliers, outsourced manufacturing, logistics service provider, distributors, wholesalers, to bring a product to market. And actually, around about 70 of those companies, we have a network of 32,000 trading partners that are participating in the network. So it kind of give you a sense of the scope and breadth. And more importantly, on the network today, we have about 100,000 or so users that come on. And what's common among these users? Well, they have the same mission to deliver the right product at the right place, at the right time, at the right cost. So this is the context of the research that we did on social and supply chain that I'm going to share with you today. Now, how did this research got started? And to be honest with you, I'll share my bias. About over a year ago, we have an annual executive customer meeting, and a number of customers came up to me and they said, Lorenzo, I think social is interesting. And my reaction was fairly skeptical, to be honest with you. I mean, I used Facebook to share a picture of my kids with the grandparents and look at Twitter, but I really couldn't see that connection. But obviously, when folks at executive level ask you something, they can tell that they had something in mind already. So we did the research this year, and we focused on 3 questions. Number 1, could social tools and social media improve the collaborative execution capabilities of our customers? And I'll define what collaborative execution means in the next slide. Then if yes, how? And obviously, a lot of these customers, I thought about this a lot more, so they were very much focused on how do we capture the kind of opportunity that Michael described. And then, more importantly, is what are the barriers that would prevent us from achieve that value that Michael described? So when we started this, I thought I would talk to 6 companies or so and again get some insights. So we asked 12 companies to participate, and my first shock is that everybody, 100% of people wanted to participate, which is the first time it happened to me in 25 years of doing this. And as a matter of fact, we went from 12 to 26 companies that had some level of participation. We have about 74 people. The focus is very much supply chain, both supply side and demand side, some procurement, and about 5% or so were CIO level folks. In general, we did have level between SVP and director participate, and we did a lot of voice of the customer sessions to get folks to explain what they meant and what they thought and what they're interested in, and also their experiences. Turns out we found a number of customers that already experimented with these kind of technologies, so they had a very good idea of what were the barriers and what was required to overcome them. And then we did some surveying across this number of companies to take a look at some broader numbers. So let's get started. First of all, let me define what we mean by collaborative execution. And this is basically the ability of a company to have good visibility to data and information across the entire supply chain, the ability to identify and recognize exceptions and issues like a shortage, the ability to decide what to do to overcome that issue, and then the ability to execute that whatever response to address the issue. So it's a closed loop, and obviously this is a continuous, ongoing process that occurs both within these companies, but more importantly across all the trading partners on the supply chain. And out of the research, we identified 3 areas where social could improve this collaborative execution. Number 1 is very much what Michael described about collaboration, communication, and really most focus on issue collaboration. It turns out that the numbers we find are even higher than what Michael described. Probably 80 or 85% or more of people's time in supply chain is spent dealing with issue that prevents that mission around right product, right place, right time, right cost. And the opportunity here is to improve the productivity, which is, Michael suggested some numbers, but even more importantly, improve the speed, because the ability to respond quicker allow to do 2 things. One is to maybe reduce inventory buffers, to avoid shortages, and also to maybe reduce the cost of expediting, and in general, improve the probability of addressing that issue. So that's one area. The second area at the bottom of the chart is really looking at social media as a potential source of early indicators of either supply risks on the left-hand side or demand sensing. And basically, let's talk a little bit about those 2. Demand sensing, obviously, everybody knows that forecast accuracy, is not very high, no matter how good the tools are. And so a number of customers were really interested in using, like Michael described, the ability to monitor social media to give a better indication of actual demand. And so I'll go through each one of these. In the case of issue collaboration, obviously there's an as-is, how it's done today, which Michael already covered a little bit. In the other ones, obviously there is no systematic way that most of the customers we talk to use to monitor risk and sense demand using this kind of technology because it's all brand new. So let's talk about issue collaboration. How is it done today? Very much we found the same data that Michael described. Number one tool is email. And what do people do here? I mean, the typical question is, what is the status of my issue? Who's working on this issue? When is it going to be resolved? And after the issue resolved, the whole reconciliation after the fact of, somebody said, yes, go ahead and expedite, and, a month in you look at it and you spend a whole bunch of time, recreating history. And very much when everything is email, it becomes a nightmare. This whole concept of, CCing somebody and then somebody's not copied. What is the latest thread? Also, big issue around, obviously, people being in different geographies. So you send an email today in the U.S. and, the supplier is in Asia and your customer is in Europe, and there's a little time delay on following all these emails. We see a bit of use of instant messaging, although not as much given the different technologies. Certain amount of phone, but the thing that shocked me was the amount of conference calls that occur. And we hear a customer talk about, weekly 2-hour conference calls just internally to go through all the issues. Everybody, to be honest, so 200 people on the call because, everybody own one. And even if you own issue number 36, you're on for 2 hours. And this spins off a bunch of other, conference call now externally with your supplier, your customers. We actually got invited to sit down in war rooms. This is actually a picture of our customer. End of quarter, or for a major issue where people get together. You got 24/7, web meetings going on, conference calls to make decisions on a real-time basis. And we even heard customers say, hey, a certain situation, I put people on a plane and I'll send them to my source manufacturer or things like that. So in general, obviously a big opportunity for productivity improvement. More importantly is because when we ask for metrics, how many people, how many emails, how many conference calls, nobody had really any data. And that's one of the frustration from executives. The feeling is there's a huge opportunity, but, if you don't measure something, obviously there's very little opportunity for improvement. So how can this change? Now, we heard a lot of examples. I'm going to pick one. And interesting enough, I'm going to mix it in because a number of our customers that we talked to already tried to implement social tools, and I've already figured out what are some of the problems. Number one is there has to be a context. People, that try to, introduce a social tool, and there's many available, I find out that people just don't go for it. So the context is really the issue. And so the desire here that we heard from customers is for systems to automatically create the social thread based on that issue. And also more importantly, one place, so not, each system have their own. So the ability to kind of bring together, for example, here it's a part shortage, what's my part, which location, how it's going to be short and so on. Be able to define high priority, low priority. And then a discussion thread into it. I mean, you see here, they're looking into a supplier that says, hey, I got that, I'm looking into it. So everybody knows that they kind of got the ball in their hand. And then a response like, hey, I can expedite some of these things, but not all of them. And so at that point, we find a couple of things. One is security comes in a big way, as was mentioned before, because you may have a situation where this part is a part that comes from one supplier to one contract manufacturer. Then how do you manage this dynamic security that is native to a supply chain? So it's not about only internal data. So a huge issue about what is the security model, who gets notified. The other aspect is, social is nice for day-to-day things, but when an issue becomes really critical, like this one here, the ability to escalate in a more formal manner. And that is, we heard of a model of ticketing, for example, is very appealing to folks. Obviously also to track approval, like approve expediting, and the ability to do that in a mobile context because people are traveling and so forth. The ability to tag things like end of quarter, for example, that can look at metrics of how many issues do I have impacting my quarter. And also the ability to throw a little bit of, call it gaming or whatever, but what could be in Facebook a like, but a thank you, and try to boost scorecards and metrics and so on. So this is what we heard across the board. Some of the barrier we heard is very much adoption. How do we make it so the information is there, the security is there, people are notified, so that people will actually use it? Because the technology itself doesn't really help. Secondly is the security we mentioned. Third is there's a whole process issue where now we're doing from email and so on to this model. There's definitely a big change management, and really then it gets into governance. What are the metrics that people are going to use to manage this, and what are the business agreements between trading partners? Having said all that, when we did survey and we asked people from, range from, hey, this is huge potential, it's definitely going to work, to it's never going to work, we find that nobody that we surveyed so far thinks this is not going to work. And actually about 80% of people we polled felt that this really has high potential, just a question of making all this technology work together. But given the adoption, especially by younger people, of social technologies, these folks are coming and is going to provide great value. So again, that's the number one area. The number two area that I want to cover is around supply risk monitoring. And because this is a brand new thing, I'm going to cover the generic model first and then going to layer in an example. And fundamentally what people are looking for is a way to take a look at all the information that people have in their transactional systems about their suppliers, their logistics routes, and so on, and take that information and go look in social media for instances of that occurring. Could be a mention about a supplier, a mention about, a port or an airport, and really look for risk semantics, delays, strikes, and then correlate together in some kind of predictive analytics, and if something is found, feed that issue collaboration that I just described. So moving on to kind of the next picture, overlay an example. Imagine that you have a number of shipments coming in the Port of Oakland, right across the bay here, arriving in the next couple of weeks. Your social media is monitoring Port of Oakland, and there is Occupy Oakland demonstration planned. And this just happened, a few months ago. Automatically, people want to know, hey, put the two together, and there's a logistic disruption, and notify not everybody, but those specific commodity managers or supply chain managers that are managing those shipments to give them a heads up. There's a risk of that shipment late arrival. There's a risk of that inventory in there to be short at a distribution center, and so they can start a collaborating process to see there's an opportunity to rebalance inventory to avoid the shortage. So that's looking at early indicator of supply risk. The next one is really flipping it around and the same model now looking on the demand side. And the most classic example we heard from a number of customers is the typical issue of doing a plan for variants, let's say black and white, pink or red, whatever you want to go. And let's assume the plan spits out, that because there's no prior history, somebody, the whole process and SNOP, wonderful SNOP process spits out 50-50. But then social media is monitoring, and they're actually finding, for whatever reasons, that there's definitely a bias where 80% of people like the white and talk about the white, and only 20 talk about the black. And then what people are looking for is the semantics to bring the information together and say, hey, you got a mismatch. You got a forecast that is 50-50 between these two models. The social media is 80-20. Obviously, there's a risk that you may have shortage of whites that look like they're maybe in demand and excess of black. Drive a collaboration to discuss this topic. So same technology, obviously different focus, but also very different response from the customer we surveyed. Obviously, the supply risk monitoring, again, consistently, nobody thought it wasn't going to work. The only thing is a question of timing. Obviously, building the semantics to go look for things like strikes, flooding, and things like that, it takes some time. So there's an issue by way of how can we use maybe social as a way to build a supply chain knowledge base to look for those things. And obviously there were some things like volcanic ash, I will predict, but could you predict, for example, heavy rain and flooding in Malaysia? And is that an opportunity? On the demand side, instead, we got a very different response, which, to be honest with you, I thought was going to be the hottest topic. And here is very much binary. We got 40% of people that thought it was the hottest thing in the world, 40% that thought it was the dumbest idea in the world, and the rest in between. And really, this, when we dug into the data is obviously consumer-driven supply chain are very excited about this. But obviously, if you're not consumer-driven, if you're making jet fighters or something like that, you can see why it may not be as applicable. The other thing is that lots of issues around governance around this. So let's assume you do find out that it's 80-20, not 50-50. How do you manage that into your planning process? When do you make that decision? And even to a point that we have some folks in the cosmetic industry that says, hey, the moment I see a disconnect, I want to fire that to my co-packers that are making the pink and red lipstick so they can adjust. And they ask for that because there's sometimes the product life cycle is measured in weeks. Obviously, in some other industry that really had a negative reaction on, wait a second, that puts into question the whole S&OP process, and it needs to feed back into it. So there's a bit of differences in terms of what the government's model is going to be on that. So that was so a lot more change management. Another one, there's a lot of question on whether the demand sensing is really a supply chain function type of process, or is it something that is more into marketing? So who would drive this? So a lot of question about ownership and so forth. So as you can see, the technology may be kind of the easiest part. Is the change management, governance, and everything else is maybe the bigger hurdle to adopting some of these new technologies. Anyway, this is a quick, glimpse of the results. One of the things I want to do, we want to try to use social into this process, and really, how can you participate? Number one, we set up an open group on LinkedIn just to use social technologies. You can either search for each open social supply chain or something like that. You can join it, or at the very least, I would invite you to answer 4 survey questions, which are the same service question we have been asking for a year. Number one, what's your personal use of social technologies? So how do you rate yourself? And then around these 3 dimensions of issue collaboration, supply risk monitoring, demand sensing, what is your opinion about them? And you will see your results as you fill it in. It will be wide open. It'll be interesting to see. The other thing is I know some of you are very passionate and are reading up to this. So if you find anything interesting, I use on Twitter the hashtag of social supply chain, or add it to this LinkedIn group. Everybody can contribute. I think a lot of people are interested in learning about this because obviously there is no ready-made tools out there, and it requires a bunch of process changes and so forth. So sharing best practices and also sharing things that didn't work, I think would be beneficial to everybody in supply chain. So with that, Frank, I'll bring it back to you.
Great. Lorenzo, thank you very much for your presentation, and Michael, same to you. A lot of great information in there, and we do have time for a few questions, so let's get started with those. And Michael, let me start off with you. In the research you've done in your observations, what are some of the sectors or the functions within an organization that you see really leading the way in the use of social technologies?
Well, because the adoption of these technologies really has been fastest in the consumer, and it's really an example of a change in the locus of innovation from the enterprise to the consumer, which is a trend which we've seen recently. A lot of the consumer-facing industries have been those that have been leading in the use of these technologies. So whether or not it's retail or CPG, et cetera, the ability to connect with consumers has clearly been one of those areas that has been leading, being able to connect there because that is now the way that the consumers oftentimes connect with each other and talk about products. But we are starting to see the use of these technologies start to take hold within the enterprise, within places where there's more opportunity for collaboration and communication, for example, in the IT field or other technical fields within engineering and product development, et cetera. Those are some of the places where that have been leading in the use of these technologies, but we do think there's tremendous opportunity for the use of these technologies in other fields, in other sectors, and in other functions in the business.
Good. It's kind of a follow-on to that. In terms of the adoption of social technologies or the willingness of an organization to use it, is there a demographic factor involved, Michael, in that? In other words, if you have a company, perhaps younger demographic, more more contemporary culture, are they more likely to really, grasp onto this than a more mature company with with a more mature workforce?
Well, what's interesting is I think a lot of times people think of these technologies as being, suitable only for a younger demographic, because there's a perception that a lot of these social platforms are being adopted most quickly amongst say Generation Y, Generation Z, et cetera. And that definitely is true. And that's part of the press for consumerization of the enterprise. You hire new graduates, they come in and they say, why can't I be as productive at work as I am at home to have the same sorts of tools which allow me to communicate, which allow me to, spread knowledge amongst a large number of people. And yet what we actually have found is that these technologies can be profitably used by, more mature, more experienced workers as well. In fact, for example, for some time period, the fastest growing demographic on using Facebook in the consumer realm have been, females over the age of 55. And so it is certainly the case that these technologies can be used, and increasingly in the consumer space are being used by our more mature colleagues. And so we believe that opportunity exists within the enterprise as well.
So it's not just a tool for the young, certainly.
Absolutely. It can be used across the board.
Okay, great. And Lorenzo, I know you've had a lot of experience working with implementations of social technologies and observing, what works and what doesn't. And do you have any tips, any insights on for a company that is trying to get a program underway, incorporating social technology in the supply chain space, say to become more collaborative? Any observations or tips you can give on how you can position that initiative for a better chance of success?
Yeah, and definitely that was one of the questions we asked specifically. And a couple of things came up. Number one, the adoption model is very much what Michael described, where people want to try it out within a kind of confined area. We heard a lot, maybe a group of suppliers, a group of commodity managers, and kind of manage it in a small kind of, let's say, prototype or pilot. That's one issue. But the second issue, really, the bringing together of the transactional information from various systems that people have into a social setting. They can be disconnected across the two. Otherwise, the usability is very hard. And then the third thing, typical issue where, the more executive sponsor oversight there was, we saw, for example, people saying, hey, we just let out the social technology, nobody's using it, and all of a sudden the senior vice president of supply chain is on and is using it, and all of a sudden people jump on. So you can't underestimate that, especially around this, issue collaborations and things like that. The moment your SVP is going to be asking questions, what's the status, and he's not going to wait for the next conference call, he's going to be online, all of a sudden this drives that. And the same thing with, I think over time, as people negotiate, supplier contracts and things like that, I believe they're going to start introducing metrics around that, ability to collaborate and the speed and the quality of collaboration. Because that is eventually, what people want to get. They want to minimize the time spent to address issues, and, if you can't get rid of issues completely, you want to just fix them very quickly.
Right.
If I could just add one other insight to the ones that we agree with that Lorenzo had as well, we have a phrase that we use, which is what's in the workflow is what gets done. And a lot of times, people launch these social initiatives, and the use of these social technologies just becomes one more thing on someone's long to-do list. And that oftentimes causes a spike in usage when it's first released because it's, the new novel thing, but then a drop-off. What we found in organizations that have embedded these technologies into the day-to-day workflow, made it the default way that people communicate and collaborate, they're much more likely to create a critical mass of participation rather than when it's just one more thing that they need to do in addition to their, quote, day job.
Right. One of the questions that I kept thinking about, during both presentations, obviously you can see the collaborative benefits of a social approach, but this whole issue of the accuracy of what's being communicated, are there any sort of governance or measures you can put in place, to ensure that the information that is being communicated, is accurate, good data?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that, because it's one of the pushbacks that when people have in a very unstructured process, phone call, email, they can say, oh, yeah, go expedite, knowing fully well there's no record of it, so that at the end of the month they can go, I don't remember ever saying that, or it gets lost, or it takes ages. So you're definitely formalizing this, which just changes the behavior of folks to a certain extent, where, you know it's going to be an auditable thing, and so on. So on that side, actually, the fact that information becomes more accurate, more trackable, has some interesting impact in the adoption. On the other side, on the issue of demand sensing and risk monitoring, today there is very little done in a structured way. So, we're not talking about, obviously, 100% accuracy that you will at disruption, or 100% accuracy of, the demand is going to be this way. But the belief is that it's definitely better information, earlier information that you're getting in today, so in the hands of the right people could be useful. But it definitely changes the behavior, because if you're in the mode of firefighting all the time, and all of a sudden and that's how you operate, and now all of a sudden you have an opportunity to make a decision to change your forecast. For example, we had actually a use case of a customer that they actually used demand sensing, and it was they were launching a new product, 2 variants, one that has a specific feature and one that did not, and really had no idea where it's going to be a split. They sensed the conversation, and it turns out that for something they haven't even thought about, a bunch of consumers really liked one of the features that only applied to one variant, and the supply chain head took a risk and says, okay, I'm going to change the forecast. And he turned into a believer when it turns out that the actual demand matched what they saw. But it was a big leap of faith, obviously, because the S&OP process were telling him one way, and he took a leap on something else because it made sense to him. So the question then, he was involved at that level. It was a prototype. How do you make that institutionalized? Because if you're monitoring one product, it's easy, but if you're monitoring hundreds of products, how are those decisions made? And that's going to take some time to get used to the governance model.
Right. Well, we're coming pretty much to the end of our session. I'd like to wrap it up with a question to Michael, and Lorenzo would certainly welcome your input as well. But Michael, this is around the research, and I wonder if you could characterize some of the key learnings that you derive from leading companies in terms of their use of social technologies. What works and what doesn't.
Well, I'd say, hearkening back to the discussion that Lorenzo and I had, certainly there's, while these technologies are to a certain extent bottom up, as Lorenzo said, the leadership is important. It's both role modeling in terms of using these technologies themselves, but also explaining to the rest of the organization, why these technologies are important. But it requires a slightly different type of leadership. Again, rather than, ordering people or including the use of these technologies in their MBOs, trying to understand what's working and then scale them up in the enterprise. Those things we find quite powerful from a leadership standpoint. Also making sure that it's part of the workflow. What's in the workflow is what gets used. Embedding these technologies, making them the default way that people communicate and turn communications into content is extraordinarily powerful as well. And so just having the right incentives in place, and many times it's, in fact, not traditional incentives, but being able to, for instance, give status to people who are contributing the most, are some of the ways that you are able to actually drive adoption in a way that so that you get quality adoption rather than quantity contributions, which sometimes a more traditional way of creating incentives will do. So those are some of the things that we found have been successful. But that being said, we're very early in the use of these technologies in terms of what we think is a multi-year journey to capturing value from these technologies. So we think we're going to continue to learn as we go forward as to how you can use these technologies most profitably across the enterprise and specifically in the supply chain.
Very good. Lorenzo, anything to add before we wrap up?
Yeah. I mean, I would agree with Michael totally. One thing that surprised me a lot is really how much the executives we talk to, the business executives, are ahead of the pack. Usually we find the opposite, new technology. But this one here, I was surprised. And really what I saw there, it really has to do with talent, where they feel that if you have these kind of technologies, kind of like chicken and egg, you will also be able to attract the best supply chain talent because they're going to want these tools and vice versa, So the folks that really want to compete based on supply chain capability and supply chain talent feel like they really need to get ahead of this because that's how they're going to attract the best talent in supply chain, and they're going to achieve the best results, which to me surprised a lot because, again, I came from kind of a little bit of bias here that, oh my gosh, what a waste of time this stuff is sometimes. But no, not at all. I find the opposite, and it's promising. Now, of course, it's early adoption. There's lots of technology issues that need to be addressed and so forth, but it's surprising how high the interest is so far.
Very good. Well, great way to end the webcast, and once again, thanks very much to our speakers, Michael Chui, Lorenzo Martinelli. Appreciate it very much. Thanks also to our sponsor, E2 Open. Appreciate your support. And mostly would like to thank all you folks who tuned in today. We hope that you found the webcast interesting and informative. We hope you were able to obtain some information you can take back and put into practical use in your own organization. So this is Frank Quinn from Supply Chain Management Review signing off.